Welcome in. Happy Monday. How we feeling? It's the end of the weekend. The week's back. Had a wonderful weekend. And I'm hungover without being hungover. I'm not a drinker, but I was in a music festival all weekend, for those who may have missed me mentioning that last week. I was at Louder Than Life on Thursday evening. Didn't go Friday because of the storms that came through Hurricane Helene, and then went all day Saturday, and then went last night for the finale with Korn. Got my Korn shirt on. You may or may not be able to see in the camera, but had a great weekend. And for those who didn't get to see the post-game show, I was not a part of that either. I was pretty much missing in action all weekend, and what a weekend it was in college football that I missed out on. I got to see the short version of the Indiana-Maryland game. Mitchell and I talk about that here later on in this episode, but the Hoosiers are 5-0, man. They're 5-0. But I enjoyed myself this weekend. I hate that I couldn't do the post-game show. Hate that I couldn't watch the Indiana game live. But a big shout-out to Drew Rosenberg and Kyler Staley, of course, for taking care of post-game duties for me this weekend while I was out enjoying myself. I believe that will be one of two, hopefully only two, post-game shows that I'll have to miss. The other one will be the Washington game later at the end of October. But other than that, should be available for the post-game shows going forward. And again, appreciate you guys for checking that out regardless. Appreciate you all subscribing. And if you haven't done so already, I'm going to go ahead and remind you once again, go ahead and do that. Subscribe, hit the bell if you want to know when we're going live, whenever we post videos, all that good stuff. And we will, I'll surely appreciate that. And appreciate you guys, all your comments and everything coming through. I got to get refocused. Being at the festivals, I tell you what, for those of you who've never been to something like that, a music festival, I'm sure many of you have been to something at least related to those, along those lines. But being at a metal festival in particular, for me, like it allows me to kind of just be in my own world, if you will. Like, I love sports. I have a lot of loves, I guess, that are part of my personality. One of the big ones for me is music. I don't talk a ton about that on this show just because this isn't necessarily the time and place for it. This is indeed a sports show, in touch with Indiana sports, powered by HoosierIllustrated.com, that is. But my other love is music, and I love rock and metal. Was raised on it. My dad, a big influence on that. He was really into pretty much anything from especially the late 90s and early 2000s. That's really where most of, I guess, my influence of the enjoyment of that came from. But I felt like I was on my own planet with some buddies of mine. My brother went with me, Justin, and a bunch of his buddies. And even though it was very rainy and muddy, it was a very enjoyable time. Probably couldn't have had a better experience considering the weather. And I won't spend too much time on this next thing as well, but I do want to mention it. All of the disaster going on in the Appalachian area, specifically East Tennessee and Western North Carolina, that just looks absolutely devastating. I don't know if you all have seen any of the photos or footage of the damage that's happened there since the hurricane kind of went through that area. But it is unheard of, the amount of, I already mentioned devastation. I don't mean to sound repetitive, but it's just horrifying, really, to look at the way that things just get washed away, and really how powerful water can be when it comes to just destroying the area or land around you. So if you're the praying type, prayers up to those people, and you just hope and pray for the best, that everybody affected can find their way out of that and move forward with their lives. And you feel very fortunate to not be in that situation, but at the same time, you feel bad for those that do have to suffer through that type of stuff. So just wanted to mention that here as we get rolling here on a Monday. Hopefully you had yourself a great weekend. Hopefully you enjoyed some college football, or maybe you found yourself at Louder Than Life this weekend, or somewhere, doing something else. I am curious, for those of you who may be in the area, let me know in the comments, and I'm dead serious. Let me know if you were at Louder Than Life this weekend, and if you happen to be, what day you went on, who you like seeing. Because this is just for me personally. I love knowing what people like musically and, who they're into. And I love checking out other bands, especially if I don't, if I'm not familiar with them. So feel free, if you want to, feel free to leave that in the comments, because I'd love to see what some of you may be interested in. All right, getting down to business for some of you, for those of you who are like, don't talk anything that's not in sports. Well, you know what? We got that out of the way. And I did want to mention that because, that was my weekend. And I cannot believe all that I missed when it comes to college football. And we'll get into some of it later once we get through the once I play the Mitchell Paige segment here in a little bit, because we'll start with Indiana. But the amount of good games between, especially like the cream of the crop when it comes to college football, was absolutely insane. The way the Miami game versus Virginia Tech finished, that was a very, that had the very controversial, I can't remember if it was a touchdown or a fumble or whatever it was, but they reviewed that forever. And I remember there's, you can't please everybody when it comes to those types of games. And that was the first example. Alabama, Georgia. My gosh. Alabama nearly blows I can't remember if they were up 4 touchdowns or 3 touchdowns at the peak of their lead, but Georgia storms all the way back, takes the lead, and Alabama scores on the very next play to win the game after Georgia retakes the lead. So Kalen DeBoer with a emphatic statement in his first major SEC matchup as the head coach at Alabama. And then you have the upset with Kentucky and Ole Miss off the heels of their near upset against Georgia the week before. They go down to Oxford and beat up on Ole Miss, who was beating up on everybody else the weeks before. So that was surprising. And we'll get into some more of that later. We'll talk about, the parlay hit. I know I said this last week, but the pattern is back, baby. I said last week we went 0 for 3, but I said if things are going to continue, we're going to go 3-0 this week. And guess what? We did. If you tailed me on the sports betting side of things, Indiana covered for us. We had USC covering against Wisconsin, and we had Illinois covering the spread as underdogs against Penn State. And that left us very happy bettors if you tailed me this weekend. And I did mention the extra game that I did not put a part of the parlay, and I'm glad I didn't, because it wouldn't have worked. Just like 2 weeks ago when we went 3-0 with the parlay, I said Louisville money line against Notre Dame, and Louisville couldn't get it done. And that's another one that I wish I got to watch more of, because apparently Louisville had a ton of opportunities to really kind of seize really the moment and potentially beat Notre Dame on the road. But Notre Dame, they needed to find a way to really get themselves back on the right path when it comes to potentially maybe making the playoff. I still think it's a big uphill climb for them, because it's going to be hard to shake a loss to Northern Illinois, especially when that Northern Illinois team may not be as good as they potentially looked when they initially beat the Fighting Irish. So let's get into some initial thoughts with Indiana before we bring in our man Mitchell Paige to really kind of hear his angle of it, because his angle of it, more than likely, you care about more than mine. And that's totally understandable. Of course, he's the dude who he lives and breathes Indiana football, because he is Indiana football. He played for the Hoosiers. But I'll just go ahead and say this. The fact that all of the things that we've talked about, all the best case scenario for Indiana, all of the talk from Kurt Cignetti that happened before the season, this guy just backs it up. And I don't get why. I don't get why. We know why we doubt even in the slightest, because it's been Indiana football. We've always thought that no matter what, that Indiana will never be able to bring in somebody who knows how to put the program on the path that they've wanted to be on for so long. And he's delivering in his first year. It's almost like Cignetti can just speak things into existence. He's, again, I feel like I'm just wasting my breath even just saying some things, because, again, a few of this stuff I cover with Mitchell, and I feel like whenever I record these segments, sometimes I'm like, man, I'm just spoiling the conversation between me and Mitchell. So I hesitate to repeat certain things. But the fact that we are a win away, and I shouldn't use the term we. I know I do that by accident sometimes. The fact that Indiana, the football program, is on the heels of being 6-0 for the first time since the 1967 season. It's, I don't want to say, I mean, it is unheard of. I almost say I don't want to say it's unheard of, but we talked about it before the season even started. The fact that there was a legitimate path to get to this point, if indeed everything that Curt Cignetti talked about would end up being true. And he's delivered on everything. All of the James Madison transfers, it seems like that stuff has translated about as seamlessly as it could. Tyson Lawton is a hell of a Big Ten running back. Curtis Rourke, I know he's not part of the James Madison transfers, but he showed this weekend that he can handle adversity. When you throw 2 interceptions on your first 2 drives, man, especially when you haven't had a turnover all season long, and at that point, this Maryland game becomes the most pivotal point in the season. I mean, that can be really hard to bounce back from. And he did. And he ended up having a good performance otherwise after those 2 interceptions. And also kudos to the defense, because Indiana didn't waver. Whenever Indiana gave the ball to Maryland on those interceptions, the drives that ensued after that, Maryland didn't score. The Indiana defense was able to find a way to get the Hoosiers the ball back. And one other thing that's crazy too, Indiana still hasn't trailed this season. They still have not been down through 5 games. And there were points during the Indiana game against Maryland, I should say, where that could have very easily been the case. But another thing that we've always seen Indiana do, anytime Maryland had an answer for Indiana's score, they seem to be able to punch right back. And that's something we also are not used to when it comes to Indiana football teams. And looking ahead to next week, you're going to be facing a Northwestern program coming off of a bye. And I don't want to say that this is a game that you should easily win, because it is a road game, but Vegas is already trending in that direction. The spread, I believe, started at 10.5, and it's already moved up to 13.5 in just, I mean, less than maybe right at 24 hours, something along those lines. Northwestern, like I said, coming off a bye, and they already have a couple of losses, one of them being to Washington on the road for their first Big Ten game. They also lost in that overtime game to Duke at home in their second game of the season. And I'll say this is a game that's going to either be a very difficult defensive battle, I feel like, just given the way that Northwestern likes to play, or if Indiana's able to dictate pace from the beginning, which we've seen they like to do. I mean, if Indiana gets off to a hot start against Northwestern next Saturday, I mean, you could almost say goodnight to that game, because I don't see any scenario where if Indiana does what they want to do early and doesn't have a slow start similar to what they had against Maryland, I mean, Northwestern can't keep up with this Indiana offense. And I don't want to say it's something we've never said before, because Indiana has had some prolific offenses in the past, but this Northwestern team is also not nearly as good as some of the better Northwestern teams that the Hoosiers have seen in years gone by. So I do think that that'll probably be what Cignetti wants to do. And I say probably, like that wouldn't be the ideal scenario, but Cignetti will probably be preaching the importance of finding a way to start fast in this game on the road. And one thing you'll hear Mitchell and I talk about is the fact that there could be a lot of red here, a lot of Indiana fans. And there are already likely going to be a decent amount of Indiana fans considering the alumni base in Chicago. But the fact that you have a rolling Indiana team that has a chance to be bowl eligible without having a loss on the season so far, I mean, it could be a home environment for Indiana, and just on a tiny field. And I'm sure the Indiana team and staff will appreciate that. But I mean, it could be night for Northwestern early. And I feel like right now I'm talking myself into taking Indiana to cover, even though whenever I initially looked at the board for this week, I don't know if that's something I wanted to flirt with, because there's also a part of me that says, all right, Indiana just got the big win against Maryland. Here comes another opportunity for a letdown. And I know we said that after the UCLA game as they went in to face Charlotte, and they didn't do the letdown, but there was a moment in that second quarter where it felt like that game was going to be a little more competitive than it needed to be. And there is a chance, if you don't get off to that hot start, that maybe you do experience a little bit of that against Northwestern on the road. And what better way? I mean, Northwestern at this point, now Indiana, if they didn't have a target on their back already, they do now. And you want to be the team, especially if you're hosting Indiana, that gets to give them their first loss in the season, bring them back down to earth, so to speak. And while a loss here wouldn't be season ruining, of course, it would definitely, this isn't the first loss that you want to take, I feel like. Like if you were going on the road to, here's your other 2 road games this season. If you were going on the road to face Michigan State or Ohio State in this week's, and let's not even talk about Ohio State, because a lot of people chalk that up as an automatic loss anyway. So we'll just use Michigan State as an example. I'd say if this were Michigan State in place of Northwestern this week, it'd be a lot more easy for Indiana fans to deal with if this ended up being the first loss. But Indiana now expects to go into, I almost said Ryan Field. That's not their current stadium anymore. We'll just say the temporary stadium. Fans now expect this team to go in there and handle business, just like this team has done at every other point so far this season. And we're less than a week away now from potentially talking about bowl eligible Indiana Hoosiers for the first time. I mean, I don't even know in 67. I'm sure it was a little bit different the way they handled it, like what bowl eligibility meant and all that type of thing. But I mean, that was the Rose Bowl team. That team started 8-0. And at that point, Indiana will be 2 wins away from tying that, Nebraska-Washington. And then you go for the spittoon game at Michigan State to potentially have the best start in the history of the program. And I know at this point, we're back to getting ahead of ourselves, right? But people said we were getting ahead of ourselves at the beginning of the season, talking about a potential 6-0 start. And now that's on the doorstep. So things are becoming a reality. And I mean, pressure will continue to build. And I don't know how much pressure is truly on this team, but the bar is already being raised for what the ceiling is. And I do think with this being the first season with Cignetti, there will be, like, there's obviously the honeymoon where people are probably at this point just going to enjoy whatever the hell happens, right? Because I'd say the floor for this team, I mean, it could be as low as 7 wins. I mean, but at that point, that would be disappointing. If Indiana finished the season 7-5 with the way that they dominate or have dominated so far this year in each of their games, 7-5 would be, I mean, it would be disappointing, as I just mentioned. I mean, and then you go back to our Hoosier Illustrated preview with myself, Kyler, and Drew, where I believe Drew mentioned 7-5. Kyler and I mentioned 8-4. And yeah, 8-4 would be great when you think big picture, like, okay, Indiana doesn't go 8-4 very often. But man, there are so many winnable games. I mean, as the ESPN FBI index suggests, every game minus Ohio State should be listed as a winnable game for this Indiana Hoosiers football team. And as we've said time and time again, that is an unheard of thing, to be able to look at the schedule and see that many games that you should at the very least be competitive in, if not be favored to win in. And it's just wild. And it's a fun ride to be on. And hopefully this ride lasts a long time. There is a chance that, I mean, I mentioned it last week, the more success that Indiana sees in this first year, the higher in demand Curt Cignetti will be from big name programs this offseason. And specifically Florida. If Florida is unable to get who they want, if Billy Napier ends up being fired, as everybody suspects it will happen, and they can't get Lane Kiffin, then who do they turn to next? I mean, if Cignetti goes 11-1, as the ESPN FBI suggests is possible, then there's no reason to think he won't be in demand by every major program that has an opening. And I mean, Indiana administration has some work to do to potentially keep him. And I'll say this, the crowd's done their part. They did their part this weekend. Shout out to the Memorial Stadium crowd of Hoosier fans that showed out for a noon kick in some, I don't want to say treacherous conditions because it could have been worse. But shout out to those who came out and stayed, because that's another turning point for this program, is getting fans in the stands and staying. And you'll hear Mitchell. I'll go. This will be the last thing I tease about Mitchell and I's conversation, and then I'll just get on with it. But you'll hear Mitchell and I talk about the scenario for Nebraska where Indiana's 6-0, and it could be I don't see any scenario where it's not the best environment in maybe the history of Memorial Stadium. And it's not that Nebraska is like, the number 2-1 team in the country, whatever it may be, but it is Nebraska. It's a brand name program that you have beaten in the last few years, but you kind of have a chance to show them, hey, we're a leg ahead of you. You may think you're doing good things under Matt Rule, and they are so far, but I mean, they don't have the momentum that this Indiana team has right now. And if you can bring them in, because Nebraska fans are used to their rowdy home environments, but how often does a Nebraska team come into Indiana Memorial Stadium, because that's what Nebraska Stadium is called too? How often do they get to come into Indiana's place and see that place full to the brim? And there will be Nebraska fans there, but they'll see a large contingency, maybe for the first time ever, of rowdy Indiana Hoosiers fans. And it'll be, even if they were to not beat Northwestern this weekend, it'll still be a kick-ass crowd next week or 2 weeks, 3 weeks from now, right? Because there's a bye week. So we'll cross that bridge when we get closer to it. So I've done a lot of rambling, and, there's nothing more to say at the moment about this that Mitchell and I do not cover as well. So without further ado, let's go ahead and bring in our man Mitchell Paige to continue talking about everything that's going great with this Indiana Hoosiers football program. Welcome to the first 5-0 Monday for your Indiana football Hoosiers since 1967. And here to chat about this 5-0 start, as always, is our man Mitchell Paige, who was in attendance for Indiana's win against Maryland this weekend.
Yeah, I was a little nervous with the radar, what the turnout would be. Unbelievable. Game was basically over. Stadium was 80% full. The team's awesome. If you haven't been, you have to go. It's bordering on feeling kind of magical, if I'm honest.
You mentioned that last week, and I was going to go into that because it is kind of getting into that territory of that magic feeling that you're talking about.
Yeah, there's just something about them. I don't know. We opened the game with 2 interceptions. I think we had 3 turnovers in the first half, and it still just doesn't feel like it's ever in question. It feels like the end is already determined, which is very bizarre.
Which is weird because it felt, whenever that was the case before, it felt like the end was always determined, but you knew it was going to be an Indiana loss. Now the tides have turned, and it feels like this team can't figure out a way to lose.
Yeah, it's exactly that. There's only, I think, a couple fan bases maybe in the country that feel, and theirs is probably a little more warranted than I do. I'm not comparing us directly to these teams, but the feeling is similar because it just doesn't feel like there's ever any stress. It's just a slow, methodical beatdown every week. We're just going to run it right at your face. We're going to convert on third down, and on defense, we're going to swarm you. It feels like there's 4 guys tackling the guy with the ball every play. They fly around. They're sound, and they're fun, man. I imagine this is what Georgia, Alabama, Ohio State fans feel like, where even if you start the game a little slow, it's inevitable that we're just going to roll you. And so far, they've lived up to it.
And I got to say, my wife actually saw this video yesterday. I think it was on your wife's social media. She was panning around the stadium, and eventually got to where you were sitting at the time, and I believe it was at the end of the game, and
Yeah.
you were doing the whole like we eating type movement, and she thought it was the funniest thing. But you were in
Yeah.
your own little world. You were embracing the magic of this new Indiana football team.
Yeah. It's only that. I'm as if you listen to this and if you've ever heard me talking, you know I'm kind of a psycho. So when I go to games, usually I'm the only psycho, but it's kind of nice. There's psychos all around. People are, I don't care if you've never cheered for Indiana again. Everybody talks about like bandwagon fans, whatever, now that we're 23rd in the nation. I don't care. All are welcome. Come be crazy. What did the ESPN FPI said? 40% chance
For the college football playoff as of right now. Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, when is the last time that happened? And who knows? Maybe this is a forever thing under Signetti. Who knows? But sometimes you just get seasons that feel a little different. If you haven't been in the stadium, go. Let's take over in Chicago. I think that place is going to be a home game north. I think
And
the
what's
whole
crazy
place is going to
is
be red.
before the season even started, the tickets for the Indiana Northwestern game were already super expensive. I don't know if it was because, I don't know. It's likely because of the high alumni base in the Chicago area for Indiana and the uniqueness of playing in that temporary stadium. And if there's any tickets left, I'm sure they're even harder to get now just because of how good this Indiana team's become. And not to say that we didn't expect it, and we have talked about this. Looking at this all in retrospect now is just weird because we all theoretically talked about the perfect scenario for Signetti and how favorable the schedule has been. And now they are on the brink of a 6-0 start. It would officially become the second best start to an Indiana football season in history behind the 8-0 start that was in 1967 and that was also the Rose Bowl year, if I'm not mistaken, correct?
Yes. Yes.
So you'd be 6-0 at the midway point in the season if you take care of business against Northwestern. I don't know if you've seen the line, Mitchell. I'm sure you have. Started off at 10.5. I think it's already up at 14. It's a little scary, but mainly just from the standpoint of you don't want to see the letdown game now, right? Do you think there is a chance that after getting another awesome win for the program that maybe you see Northwestern be a little more competitive against Indiana than you might expect, especially with them coming off of a bye week?
Yeah. I think I've talked about them a ton. It can be dreary up there. Depending on the weather, you get some of the lake effect. It's maybe a little chillier. They haven't been super explosive, at least in their first 4 games, but they're always stingy. Uh, they're always well coached, and it just doesn't. Some games you look at and you're like, okay, there needs to be a lot to go right for Northwestern for this to even be a game. But it doesn't feel like that whenever you're playing Northwestern specifically. And it's for the reasons I just mentioned. The stadium is sleepy. If this was a home game, I think Indiana wins by 5 touchdowns.
Yeah.
But it's just a sleepy atmosphere. Unless, I anticipate the entire stadium being red, literally the whole stadium, and that'll help a bunch. It's a classic kind of letdown. We're 5-0. We're finally ranked. Northwestern has just been really bad on offense. Yeah, if there was going to be a letdown spot, this is kind of it, and we'll see how they manage. Not the new hype, but the continued hype.
You're not wrong when you say that because there are different levels to what's happened so far this year. There was obviously the beginning of the season where you just like to see them execute against teams they're supposed to do well against with FIU and Western Illinois. Then you go out on the road, you raise the bar by getting a road win against a brand new team in the Big Ten with UCLA. Even though they may not be very good, you completely dominate them from start to finish. Excuse me. Then you have this weekend where you kind of have one of those 50-50 games against Maryland where it was kind of back and forth for a while. You took control in the second half. You somehow cover the spread, even though you turn the ball over 4 times, and you also hit the over in this game. So that once you do all those things, that raises the bar another level. And at this point is, I guess, just see how far you can take it, right? And when we talked about how the ceiling keeps getting raised for this team, the ESPN FBI that we so frequently mention thinks Indiana has a decent chance to go 11-1, which even saying that out loud, it seems like complete nonsense. But again, the further you get into this, the less nonsensical it actually becomes because they keep delivering.
Yeah, I think you'd referenced what we were talking about before the season. And we talked about this being a possibility, but it was almost with like childlike excitement, right?
Yes.
It
Yeah.
felt unrealistic. Even as the words were coming out of my mouth, you hope for the best, but expect the worst, kind of. And I mean, there's a legitimate chance I think that they're going to be 10-0. Like, and I actually am getting myself to believe it 10-0 when they go to Columbus. I think
And
they
I'll
handle
say this
business.
too. Even though I don't think Michigan is as good as their number 10 ranking indicates, I hope they keep finding ways to win just so that
100%. I would love them to
whenever
be
Indiana gets to
6,
that
7,
game,
8.
it looks a lot better, of
Yeah.
course.
If they can be 6, 7, 8, because by then the college football playoff will be out, the rankings and stuff. Indiana may sneak in on some of those. Uh, if Michigan comes in as the number 6 or 7 team and you just take it to them, that'd be huge. Nebraska obviously is still a fishy one. I don't think, and this is gonna annoy some of our friends, Dustin and his girlfriend, but I don't think they really are very good. I really don't. I think they've got a lot of talent, but I just don't. For whatever reason, I'm not afraid of them. I was much more afraid of Maryland than I am for Nebraska, and maybe that's just because of what history tells me. Maryland's always been kind of a thorn in the side to Indiana, and Nebraska has been so bad for so long, kind of like Indiana. Um, I don't know if that plays into it.
I do think part of it too with Nebraska, especially when you take Indiana and Nebraska facing each other specifically, you have a fifth-year senior with Indiana's quarterback who knows exactly what he's doing, knows how to be calm, versus even though you have a phenom in Dylan Raiola with Nebraska, I mean, he's a baby freshman. I mean, he's going to make mistakes. He looked awful in the overtime frame against Illinois, and he's going to continue to have to grow before he really gets to his full potential. I bet give it a year or two, he'll probably be the best quarterback in college football. Maybe I'm wrong about that, but I feel like he's going to end up being that guy, maybe even a number one draft pick down the line. Maybe I'm just expecting too much, but it just feels like it's been a while since really Nebraska specifically has had a quarterback that seems to have that much promise behind him. So maybe that's why it seems like there's so much hype behind him.
Yeah, I just don't trust him. My first exposure to Nebraska was in 2002 when I've told you before I was a Miami Hurricanes fan, diehard growing up. And if you're familiar with the history of college football, that Miami Hurricanes team, I don't care what you say about the 2019 LSU team, Miami team was the best team ever assembled, and it wasn't close. And Eric Crouch was the quarterback at Nebraska. He just won the Heisman, yada, 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 and Miami beat him like 50-7. So that's the first experience I have with the Cornhuskers. And nothing's really changed since then. They have 100 million fans that think they're the best, and they have an awesome stadium, and I think awesome uniforms and great tradition, whatever. And then they just lay out stinkers. And I think that Indiana is going to have no problem with them. But that's looking forward. I know that's next week. 2 weeks from now.
Oh yeah, I mean the lovely. How do you even say this? I mean, I know how to say it. I'm word vomiting, if you will. You have the perfect bye week right at the midway point of the season, and I know you have 2 bye weeks, and it feels like the second bye week comes at the second best opportune time, which is right in between Michigan and Ohio State.
It is funny. The more you dive into this schedule, this is a schedule from the gods. If you believe in college football gods, this is a gift from them.
And what's even crazier about it too is they redid this schedule like 2 or 3 different times because of all the different shuffling around with the teams and stuff like that.
Yeah, I'm going to continue to say it. If you haven't been in the stadium, if you have the ability to, you need to go. The energy, we walk through the tailgate fields, and those are always excitable, right? They're always pretty good, but they're full, packed to the brim. And I'm doing my typical, make sure you go in the game, yelling at everybody. And usually I get a look like, get away from me. Who are you? And this time people were like, well, of course, where else would I go? And they start following. It was it was in droves into the stadium. It started off I was a little nervous, right? for the opening kick, and people were coming into the stadium all the way through probably the end of the first quarter. It was just a constant wave of people. It was rainy, semi-cold, and they just stuck it out. I'm so excited. I'll be in the building again for Nebraska. I
And
can't
that
even.
is, again, we're all the more closer to, again, the other thing we've talked about since the beginning, I almost said nightmare scenario, maybe more so a nightmare for Nebraska potentially, but you come in, you're 6-0, you've already hit bowl eligibility. You are facing a Nebraska team who won't be undefeated, unfortunately. That was the other part of the dream that unfortunately will not happen. But you have homecoming, you have Hoosier hysteria that weekend, and it just feels like it sets up perfectly to be probably the biggest Saturday, maybe probably, I don't want to say of the entire collegiate athletics calendar for Indiana, because you never know how Indiana basketball is going to end up being. But as it stands right now, I don't see a better situation for a top-notch crowd. Maybe, I mean, I guess the only other better situation you could have is if you're unbeaten going into the Purdue game at the end of the year, because at that point you're just like, wow, how the hell did this happen?
Yeah. And I'm going to touch on the basketball thing. There's a reason that football brings all the money. If Indiana can find a way to execute Saturday, you get 2 weeks of build up to this homecoming game. Basketball is awesome, but typically it's freezing. Tailgate scenes are kind of light. Doesn't even matter when the game is. There's only 18,000 people that can fit in there. You have a big football Saturday where you can get 50,000 people in the stadium, plus an additional 50,000, 100,000, who knows, tailgating. And you get Hoosier hysteria that people will always love. And it's still a basketball school. It is. But when you have a football team that's producing it, there's just nothing like it. The weather is crisp, and it just I get chills thinking about it, honestly.
I mean, really, I mean, it'll be October 19th. You're legitimately nearly a month into the fall season at that point. There's no reason it shouldn't be the most absolute perfect fall day in Bloomington. And I plan on being up there as well, as long as the University of Louisville does not play at a conflicting time. If they play on opposite ends of the day, if Indiana's at noon and U of L's at night, I'll be there, or vice versa. If Louisville's at noon and Indiana's at night, I'll be there.
So let me tell you a little thing. This is behind the scenes in Mitchell Paige's world. This doesn't really matter about Indiana. I will 100% be at Indiana no matter what. But in the scenario that you just talked about, where Indiana plays early, Miami plays late, or Louisville plays late, and Miami plays Louisville.
For reference, for those who don't know, I reference Louisville because I have to run post-game shows for them.
Yep.
That's the only reason I say that.
Louisville plays Miami that day.
That is true.
In Louisville. So if it works out that they're at the opposite ends of the spectrum, I will probably go to both games. We're going 2 for 1 Saturday. And
at that point, I need you calling into the Louisville postgame show, especially if Miami were to beat them, because that'd be hilarious.
They're going to beat the brakes off them. It's going to be a big problem for those guys. We're not a Miami postgame show, but the fact that they got by Virginia Tech this weekend, ain't nobody going to beat them.
It's just good vibes all around for all the football this year, isn't it? And again, your newborn daughter, MP, she's undefeated.
10-0. There she is in the back.
There you go. Listen to that.
She's 10-0.
Ears are burning, as they say.
She knows it. She was never even afraid. She's by far the most successful Paige, and she's been on Earth for 3 months.
That's the way to do it right there. And, man, I guess we'll go. Anything else we want to talk about before we wrap this thing up? Or I mean, there's not much else to say, I feel like, other than what we've already hit on.
Yeah, I'll just finish with another clinical performance. You punch yourself or shoot yourself in the foot 4 separate times. I think there's some statistic when you turn the ball over 4 times, your chance of winning goes down to like 0.5% or something. And Indiana didn't just win, they smoked them. It was 42-21 realistically. Like, you give up a late touchdown. I mean, they doubled them up. It was never close, never in
And there were a
doubt,
lot of
never in
people
question.
bitching about the defense, which I know it wasn't ideal comparatively speaking, but at the same time, Maryland has a really good offense.
Yes. So you say the people are mad about Indiana's defense. Maryland's offense was on the same level as Indiana's coming into the game. Their quarterback, I think, had more yards, more touchdowns. They were moving at a really, really good rate. And the fact that Indiana's D-line can get to the quarterback as often as they did, play as good a third down defense as they did. Like you have to, all things are comparative, right? Maryland's got explosive receivers. Okay, we gave up a couple long passes. That happens. They have good players that are on scholarship too. Sometimes you just get beat. It happens. And they were able to it never felt like we got on our heels. And I'm going to continue to say that. It always feels like we're churning forward. Sometimes it's a little slower than normal or slower than we would like, but it feels inevitable that train's going to get rolling, and you better get out of the way if you're on the tracks. And Maryland's quarterback felt like he was on the tracks a couple times. He just got hit and hit and hit and hit. And that's how you take an offense like that out of the game. 21 points through 55 minutes. It's not a winning combination for Maryland, especially on the road. So, yeah, we'll see this weekend. This is a much less potent offense, but I think a little stingier defense. But if they keep executing, I'm not sure who's going to beat the Hoosiers for a while.
Chance to go 6-0 for the first time in a very long time. Mitchell Paige, I appreciate your time as always. And as always, we'll do it again next Monday.
Yes, sir. 6-0 coming at us.
Big shout out, as always, to Mitchell Paige for taking the time to give us his thoughts on how the Indiana Hoosiers are doing in football. We haven't had to do any negative segments about that yet this year, which is crazy because when we used to do the This Week in Indiana Football podcast a couple of years ago, and then last year when we did the right here on HoosierIllustrated.com, as a matter of fact, we did Indiana Football in Review as kind of an unofficial test run for doing something like this in the future. Didn't know that this would eventually be the result of that, but it was definitely fun, kind of getting our feet wet with Hoosier Illustrated and Kyler and Alec and the gang. So again, as always, shout out to our man, Mitchell Paige. All right, we're going to do something a little fun. At least I think it's fun. Hopefully you think it's fun as well. And this is something that usually we do during basketball season, right? But we're going to do a little, I don't know if investigating is the right word. We're going to dive into a little bit of college football playoff bracketology because as of right now, there's a couple of dudes from ESPN who currently have the Hoosiers slotted in their college football playoff top 12. And we'll see what the bracket would look like if the college football playoff had started today, I should say, and Indiana were involved. And we'll start off with Bill Connolly, since he was the first one a couple of weeks ago to put Indiana in his top 12. So he currently has the Hoosiers slated as the number 11 seed in the college football playoff. And looking at the bracket, what it looks like, if you're the 11 seed, that has you facing the 6 seed, which in Bill Connolly's top 12, that would be none other than the Tennessee Volunteers. So you'd have a chance to go down to Knoxville, which would be very difficult to do, by the way, and get a victory, get some revenge from that Gator Bowl game from all the way back when Tom Allen was making a name for himself with the Indiana Hoosiers. And again, because the first round is played in home sites, that would be, you have to go down to Tennessee and play in one of the most rowdy stadiums in college football with one of the rowdiest fan bases with the University of Tennessee Volunteers. And not only that, you'd have Taven Jackson returning back to Knoxville for the first time since he transferred to Indiana. So a couple of interesting storylines if that were to end up being the case for Indiana, if things played out that way. And if they were to find a way to win that game, they would move on to face 3-seed Miami, Mitchell Paige's Miami Hurricanes. And obviously he's an Indiana Hoosier, but his first love, as we were talking about first loves earlier, or different loves, whatever it may be, was the Miami Hurricanes. So imagine man, imagine the roller coaster ride right there. If Mitchell had the chance to watch Indiana and Miami face off in a playoff game. And I do believe those are also campus games because I believe the semifinals, the semifinals are all, no, excuse me. I was going to say I thought they were all at home. Only the first round is campus sites. The quarterfinals, or the Elite Eight, if you will, is played in the Sugar Bowl, the Rose Bowl, the Peach Bowl, and it's not the Orange Bowl. I believe it's the Fiesta Bowl. And then the semifinals are the Orange Bowl and the Cotton Bowl, with the national championship being played at the, and again, it's not a bowl game, of course. It's just the 2025 national championship. That'll be at Mercedes-Benz Stadium in Atlanta. But yeah, just getting back to the quarterfinals for a second, you would face Miami. Again, if it played out this way, the storyline for Mitchell specifically, I wish I'd have looked at this. We could have talked about the hypothesis, and maybe we'll do this next week if it ends up still playing out this way. But that would have to be just unbelievable, and just really not even be able to imagine the scenario where your two favorite teams are good enough to be playing in the playoff against each other and a chance to get to potentially the semifinals of the first ever college football playoff. Insane, right? And then we won't go too much further, but if you were to advance past that, you play one of three between 2, 10, and 7. That would be either Ohio State, Penn State, or Missouri. And then, you face the other side. And again, we're getting way too ahead of ourselves. But I do want to go ahead and look at the next guy that has Indiana projected in the college football playoff, and that is Harry Lyles Jr. He's got Indiana slated as the 10 seed instead of the 11 seed, so a little higher from our guy, Harry Lyles Jr. And let's see what that would look like when it comes to the bracketology of all of this. So again, Indiana, the 10 seed for Harry Lyles, and the 10 seed faces off against the 7 seed. That would have Indiana facing, man, I got so many tabs open here. That would have Indiana facing Georgia. My goodness. Georgia as the 7 seed. I hate saying that, feels like a death sentence, but maybe it isn't. We don't know how good ultimately this Indiana team is against that style of competition just yet. And I feel like I'm discrediting Tennessee. They're really good too. But Georgia being the powerhouse that they've been for the last several years, it definitely just off of the top of your head feels like a lot more daunting of a task than traveling to Knoxville and facing Tennessee. But if Indiana were to do what many would probably say is the unthinkable, go down to Athens, Georgia, and beat down an SEC team on their home field, again, it just sounds crazy to even talk about this. They'd move on to face the 2 seed, which would it be Ohio State? I'm assuming. Let's take a look here. Yes, Harry Lyles currently has Indiana facing Ohio State, which I get, if I'm not mistaken, here's how that would probably play out, right? That would mean Indiana probably went 11-1 with that loss being to Ohio State. But here's what would happen. You'd play Ohio State again in the Big Ten championship if they were undefeated and you were number 2 in the Big Ten, of course. And you'd face them for potentially a third time, which is crazy to think about. Indiana facing any team any team twice is already crazy, especially that close together. If that played out that way, you would be playing Ohio State 3 out of 5 games back to back. You'd have Ohio State on the road. You'd have Purdue at home after that. Ohio State in the Big Ten championship. The theoretical Georgia game on the road. And then Ohio State again. That's crazy that could potentially play out that way. And, I mean, that'd be insane. And then again, you have the old adage that it's tough to beat a team 3 times. And imagine if Ohio State was 2 for 2 against the Hoosiers and then gets a third crack at them. That could be something. And again, these scenarios are very crazy because this is the first time I've even done this little game in my head of how all of this can play out. But just wanted to visit that for the first time, and hopefully that's not the last time we get to do that, because the further Indiana gets into this adventure of the 2024 college football season, the more real that this ends up becoming. Because all it takes is I mean, probably 2 losses, especially one of them is seen as that guaranteed loss against Ohio State, which I hate even saying that because anything can happen. We saw what happened with Kentucky this weekend and beating Ole Miss, and they nearly beat Georgia the week before that, off of the heels of getting their ass beat by South Carolina. So, guaranteed loss, it's just something that we use to say, or basically assume that like there's no reason that team should lose. So really calling it a guaranteed loss is not the best way to do it. It's just an assumed loss. So if you have something in addition to that Ohio State loss, I hate to say that it automatically kicks you out of the playoff conversation, because there will be teams that get the grace of having a second loss that get in more than likely. And there may even be some that can get in with 3, especially when you look at the SEC and the pedestal that they're put on. So, I mean, you look at Georgia right now, they have 1 loss and they're only the number 5 team in the country. Or when I say only, like they've only dropped to 5. They could take a second loss and they'd probably go to number 10. And then let's just say they get to the SEC championship and lose to Alabama, who's number 1 in the country. They'd probably still stay in at number 11, depending on what happens behind them. So, I mean, again, we've never seen this play out before, but it is fun, this new element to college football that involves the playoff. And in the very first iteration, we get to have some fun in including the Indiana Hoosiers in the conversation. So, yeah, we'll revisit this in the coming weeks as Indiana continues on with their season, as long as they stay viable in it. It's unfortunate to say, but if they do find a way to lose to Northwestern this weekend, I mean, no one's going to have them in the playoff after that. Because, I mean, yeah, you can still have a good season, but, I mean, no one's going to assume you're going to make it much more noise, at least big-time noise, if you lose to a middling Northwestern program that you're already projected to potentially beat by 2 touchdowns, on the road for that matter. So, let's go ahead and get into a few more results while we've got a few more minutes from around the Big Ten this week. Rutgers, that was a big game that we talked about last week. I didn't bet on it, of course. I already talked about the parlay, but they were able to get a big dub against UW, the Washington Huskies at home, 21-18. I believe Washington had a chance to tie that game, if I'm not mistaken, with a field goal, and they missed. And Rutgers moved to 4-0, and they're actually not receiving a whole lot of love when it comes to the AP poll. And I guess like Indiana, they haven't really played. I mean, they've played better teams than Indiana potentially. I don't know how good Washington really is. They also beat a Virginia Tech team on the road that nearly beat Miami last week. So I don't know what it's going to take for Rutgers to get into the top 25, but they may be the next Big Ten team to do so if they continue on their trajectory. Ohio State took care of business against Michigan State on the road. Michigan State suffers their second loss of the season, and Indiana and Ohio State collectively have the 2 best offenses in the Big Ten conference so far. I believe they're behind Ohio State barely. I could be wrong about that. I know they're the top 2. I don't know who's number 1, who's number 2, though, off the top of my head. Oregon went down to UCLA, 134-13. So by the transitive property, Indiana's 8 points better than Oregon right now. And again, I say that jokingly, but Indiana was able to find a way to win by more than Oregon did. And we've seen Oregon struggle this year a little bit against teams that they probably should have beaten a little more handily, like Idaho, like Boise State. I know Boise State's had they got a potential Heisman Trophy winner on their team this year. So maybe that Boise State close game isn't something necessarily to be too upset about if you're an Oregon fan, but they took care of business against an old Pac-12 rival who is now Big Ten rivals with them in the Big Ten, and they moved to 4-0. The game I mentioned, that was part of my parlay that helped me out, at least from I guess I had 2 other than Indiana, of course, but Penn State only beats Illinois by 14, 21-7. Happy to see that, for financial reasons, and not that I rely on betting for, major finances, but, it is money that's involved. Penn State moves to 4-0. Tom Allen got the Penn State defense looking good. I don't know if y'all saw this, by the way. Tom Allen handed over what do they call it? Helmet communication duties to one of his analysts because apparently he's hard to understand with his crazy raspy voice. And that's just kind of funny to think about Tom Allen screaming into his players' helmets as they're on the field. And they're like, man, what the heck is he saying? He's just spouting nonsense because I can't understand what he's saying. So interesting there. Michigan able to get away from Minnesota, win by 3. Still, like most people probably, the jury is out for me on Michigan on how good they'll actually be. They don't have much of a passing presence, but they're able to get things done with defense and the ground game. And they've made it to 4-1 so far with a decent win against USC last week. And I say decent, that's a good win, of course. They're able to get things done against Minnesota, a 2-3 Minnesota team that, probably still has decent aspirations to get to maybe 6-6 or 7-5. But I think a lot of people are looking, especially from an Indiana perspective, are looking at Michigan now as, Indy. This was the other game that people initially said was the other guaranteed loss. That ain't the case anymore. Michigan is very beatable. And that doesn't mean that they're bad, of course, but they're just not what they were previously with Connor Stallions and Jim Harbaugh. We got to throw Connor Stallions in there because he was an instrumental part of their success the last 3 years with the sign stealing. USC also got done for me in the betting side of things, beating Wisconsin 38-21 as Wisconsin made their debut out on the West Coast and moving forward without Tyler Van Dyke. And USC bouncing back from their loss to Michigan, still trying to make their case for getting the college football playoff, getting the Big Ten, I should say. So we'll see what USC can do moving forward. For some reason, I know Indiana doesn't play USC, but whenever I'm putting together power rankings for teams, I'm in a Big Ten group that it's just for fun. It's not like official or anything like that, where we throw together power rankings for the conference each week. And I, for some reason, even though Indiana's unbeaten at this point, I, for some reason, have a hard time putting Indiana above USC, just because I feel like if that game were to happen, that Indiana would lose to them. Whether, at home, maybe, I don't know, maybe it depends. You got to think neutral site with this type of stuff, right? I just feel like neutral site, USC would beat Indiana. And, I know that's negative, but hey, it's just the way I feel about that. Talked about Indiana, Maryland, of course. And then one more thing we'll mention. Nebraska 28, Purdue 10. The result, not necessarily the biggest story here, although it was tied at halftime, 0-0. But Purdue decided to fire their offensive coordinator yesterday. And, only 4 games into the season. And it's crazy. One thing that I feel like fuels all of this negative energy from one, obviously losing is one, but when you see the rival program having success, especially when not long ago you were the program having success, I think it can sometimes cause coaches and fans alike to want to make changes quickly. Like, we got to fix this now. And maybe it ends up being good for them in the long run, but it just seems very premature to fire somebody that far in, close into the season. Again, I don't know. I don't follow Purdue as closely as I do Indiana, of course. But, we saw Indiana firing coordinators midseason before. But, again, that's when Purdue was having success under Jeff Brom. So it's just funny whenever you compare yourself to the rival program and seeing how things are going. And you kind of almost have to hit the panic button because, why can't we have success? And, Indiana fans were saying the same thing, including myself, a couple of years ago when Purdue was getting it done. I know a lot of people chalked it up to Purdue being in the Big Ten West, but hey, it's, this is the reality now that we're in. No Big Ten West, no divisions. You just play who's on your schedule and move forward. So that'll wrap it up for the CFB results. And just a couple more minutes before I wrap things up, I do want to at least mention the Colts finding a way to get back. Not even get back from the win column. They've now won 2 in a row. Started off 0-2, now 2-2. And Anthony Richardson finds a way to get hurt again, right? And Joe Flacco, thankfully for the Colts, you've got somebody behind you that, in all honesty, I'll just be blunt about it. Joe Flacco should probably be the guy moving forward, even if Anthony Richardson is able to get back. And many people may disagree with that, but I don't think Anthony Richardson is the long-term answer for Indianapolis. And Joe Flacco's not the long-term answer either. But if you want to find success, you have somebody who knows what that is in Joe Flacco, and he put together a good performance against the Steelers yesterday. And maybe they have a path moving forward to get to the playoffs. I mean, things were not looking good through the first 2 weeks. And I know people say you have to give Anthony Richardson a chance. And I know you kind of do. You didn't just draft him for no reason, but you also want to win, right? Like, you don't just want to be sitting there and be a 7-10 team, 8-8 team, whatever it is. I can't even think of how many games are on the NFL anymore. I know they keep extending it, I feel like, and just missing out on the playoffs. You want to be competitive as competitive as you can. And right now, I feel like Joe Flacco can give you that extra advantage that maybe you wouldn't have otherwise. Whereas with Anthony Richardson, it's more of a risk. Yeah, maybe it could pay off in the long run, but I think early returns, especially with all of his injuries, show that that's not going to end up being a good investment for you. And I know a lot of people even thought that from the get-go. Like, why take him? Take somebody else. So that's my little tidbit on the Colts. Maybe we'll check in with Bob Kravitz here again in a few weeks, or somebody else that wants to chat some NFL. But until then, we'll go ahead and wrap up today's episode of In Touch with Indiana Sports. Thanks for bearing with me. I appreciate you all, as always. Sorry once again that I wasn't available for the post-game wrap-up show. Be back for them again this weekend as Indiana takes on Northwestern. And as always, subscribe on YouTube if you haven't already. We're getting closer to 500 subscribers. Appreciate all those who have subscribed over the last couple of weeks. And check out everything going on at HoosierIllustrated.com with Kyler Staley, Alec Lasley, Drew Rosenberg, and Dylan Traeger. Great staff, as always. I know it sounds like I'm buttering them up, but I could not ask for a better group of dudes to be able to do this with. And it's been a fun ride, just a couple of months into this new journey of doing the show on HoosierIllustrated.com. So until Wednesday, this has been another episode of In Touch with Indiana Sports, powered by HoosierIllustrated.com.